Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about the world a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me. Holy smokes, I read that paragraph and I'm just immediately convinced that I'm about to go on a philosophical roller coaster, which is exactly what Herman Melville's Moby Dick is. What's up guys, it's the host, you're watching The Gray Medium, and today I'm diving into my first of 5 parts on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. I originally wanted nothing to do with Herman Melville's writings, especially Moby Dick, until a professor of mine introduced me to Benito Cereno, and since then I've really just fallen down the rabbit hole that is Herman Melville's writing. For this first video, I'm going to go ahead and tackle chapters 1 through 25 in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. For each video, I'm going to pick out 5 chapters that really stood out to me. So for today's video, talking about chapters 1 through 25, the 5 most important chapters to me were chapters 1, Loomings, chapter 9, The Sermon, chapters 12 and 13, Biographical and Wheelbarrow, those two go hand in hand, and then chapter 24, The Advocate. For the next video, I'm going to go ahead and cover chapters 26 through 50. If you're interested in watching parts 2, 3, 4, or 5, go ahead, check out the description down below. Those will be linked there as they are uploaded. And if you're new to The Gray Medium, this is the channel where I'm constantly trying to find the balance between black and white, or in my case, gray. What that means to me is trying to find the balance between mind and body. So regardless of if I'm in the library reading books or if I'm in the gym lifting weights, I'm always trying to do one thing in order to improve upon my mind or my body. But without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into chapter 1, Loomings. Ishmael uses this chapter really just to draw attention to the fact that life on land, or just life in general, gets boring and mundane and repetitive, and he's essentially going to the sea, he's eventually going out to the ocean in order to combat this boring, repetitive, redundant lifestyle that ultimately everyone has to face at one point or another. He makes it a point to explain that most men feel driven to the point of insanity in one way or another, in one point or another in their lives. He views life on land as limiting and makes note that men have a natural inclination to the coast. However, where most men stop, on the beach, is where his journey truly begins. He believes that we're limited while we're on land, and that there is some kind of divine truth or some sort of wisdom or knowledge that can be gained from really going out to sea and throwing oneself out into the ocean. And this makes a lot of sense. Even today, hundreds of years after this book was written, people want these beachfront properties. Everyone wants to go to the beach. The idea of being on the coast is absolutely romanticized. But even when you go to the beach, you'll recognize, at least here on the Southern California coast, the vast majority of people simply go to the beach and sit on the sand. Going there and viewing the beach, going there and viewing the ocean from the outside looking in is like being a passenger on a ship. Whereas going to the beach and actually taking the initiative to go swim in the water or to surf or to actually get engaged in the ocean and the giant ecosystem that the ocean is, that's more like going as a sailor. Which is the huge thing that Ishmael really drives home in this first chapter. He's trying to differentiate between between going on a ship as a sailor and going on the ship as a passenger. Going as a passenger is much easier, but not nearly as rewarding, whereas going as a sailor is taxing, it's humbling, it's humiliating, but ultimately it's rewarding and it's spiritual. He makes it a point to state how everyone has to be willing to get thumped by life every now and then. Everybody has to be willing to get humbled by life, and that's part of the living experience. That's how you live, that's how you learn, that's how you grow. Experience as a sailor is true, pure, and unique, whereas experience as a passenger is simply watching from the sidelines. And if there's anything we learned from my 5-video series on Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols, it's that in dream imagery, in story imagery, in any kind of myth or legend or tale, a physical journey is oftentimes representative symbolically of a spiritual or a mental one. When we're covering great distances physically, we're oftentimes also covering great distances mentally or spiritually parallel to our physical journey. And I feel like this chapter perfectly sets the tone for the entire book, because it's almost as if Melville himself is asking you, look, are you really going to dive into this book, or are you just going to sit back and watch from the sidelines? Are you going to stay on the shore, stay like a land dweller, and not actually dive into the depths of what is Herman Melville's Moby Dick? When discussing these land dwellers who are too fearful to actually go into the water and embrace the journey, Ishmael writes, "Nothing will content them but the extremest limit of the land. Loitering under the shady lee of yonder warehouses will not suffice. No, they must get just as nigh the water as they possibly can without falling in." So, as I wrap up chapter 1 and we head into the rest of this book, just know I refuse to stay on the shore. We're diving into Moby Dick, and we're really taking on the depths of the ocean and everything that it has to offer. Okay, so the second chapter that I really felt the need to touch up on was chapter 9, The Sermon. This chapter takes a whole new approach to reinventing the story of Jonah. While Ishmael is wandering through the streets at night, he ends up finding a church that is heavily themed around whaling. He's in a whaling town, so this church is almost exclusively reserved for the families of people who have lost whalers at sea, the family of, widows who have lost their husbands out at sea while they're whaling. It seems as if this whole church has like a really strong whaling theme, and even the pastor, even the man giving the sermon, is actually conducting himself like a captain with the way that he delivers commands and the way that he walks around and really commands the sermon the same way that a captain would command a ship. Father Mapple is the chaplain who's giving this sermon, and he uses the story of Jonah, rather a more modernized, added on to story of Jonah, in order to deliver his message. There's an interesting aspect that's added to the story when the captain of the ship that Jonah is fleeing onto ultimately can tell one way or another by Jonah's body language or his demeanor that Jonah is a fugitive, that he's running from trouble. And there's an interesting commentary made here about how this captain of the ship knows that Jonah's a fugitive and knows that he probably shouldn't be harboring a fugitive, but ultimately he knows that since Jonah is a fugitive, he's desperate to get away, and he could get away with charging Jonah thrice, as the text says, or as I would imagine, triple, right? He charges Jonah thrice the amount that he would charge a normal sailor to come aboard his ship. Knowing that Jonah doesn't have a choice, he has to pay this amount because he needs to get on this ship to run from God. I'm not sure what Melville was getting at here as far as this captain being able to tell that Jonah was a fugitive and charging him even more money, but I think it's really interesting to entertain people's thoughts on what exactly this part of the text means. So if you've read this chapter and you're familiar with it, go ahead and voice your opinion in the description down below, in the comment section down below rather. I have a little theory on what I think it means, but there's no concrete evidence behind it, so I'll save that for another video. Another part that's added onto this story of Jonah is a point in which the captain introduces him to his room. Jonah can't lock his door from the inside, however the door can be locked from the outside, which seems to be allegorical or even just hinting at this idea of how prisoners who are stuck in a prison cell ultimately can't unlock themselves from the inside, the same way that Jonah can't unlock the belly of the whale when he's inside of it. Ultimately, the fugitives who are in the wrong, who are serving time as punishment for whatever it is that they did, they're not in control of their own salvation. That's ultimately left up to God. And while in this room, there's a really interesting scene in which Jonah wakes up amidst the storm. The storm has the ship tilting and leaning from side to side, and there's a lamp that's hung from a chain from the ceiling, and essentially the lamp is hanging straight down, which is his reference to notice that the walls themselves are actually crooked, meaning that the ship is moving from side to side pretty violently, and that's a big part of what raises high alert to Jonah to actually get up and go up to the top of the deck. From there, the rest of the story of Jonah plays out. He goes up onto the deck. One way or another, he ends up overboard, and he ends up getting swallowed by a great whale. However, the chaplain, Father Mapple, seems to really hit the nail on the head here when he's talking about the lessons learned in the book of Jonah. On page 52, he writes, "Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord out of the fish's belly. But observe his prayer, and learn a weighty lesson. For sinful as he is, Jonah does not weep and wail for direct deliverance. He feels that his dreadful punishment is just. He leaves all his deliverance to God, contenting himself with this, that spite of all his pains and pangs, he will still look towards his holy temple. And here, shipmates, is true and faithful repentance, not clamorous for pardon, but grateful for punishment. I do not place Jonah before you to be copied for his sin, but I do place him before you as a model for repentance. Sin not, but if you do, take heed to repent of it like Jonah." It seems as if later on in this book, this very sermon greatly affects Ishmael and his way that he approaches whaling. I won't get into that until a later chapter, but the two lessons learned from this chapter are really important, and I do feel like they set you up to better understand the rest of this novel. Ultimately, lesson 1 is that Jonah didn't pray for immediate release from his suffering, but rather accepted it and embraced it as a just punishment for disobeying God. He accepted God's punishment for him. He repented, but he didn't immediately ask for deliverance. He just accepted the punishment for what it was. And the second main lesson is that those who turn away from God after he calls upon them to spread the truth will face God's wrath. Whether that's in the form of a storm or a great whale, one way or another, they will face God's wrath. I found this chapter and the way that it really reinvents the story of Jonah was really powerful, and it really paves the way for how just poetic and just really beautifully written the rest of this book is. So I would really recommend that you guys read chapter 9, the sermon. So the third and fourth chapters I really want to touch up on, I'm going to do together because they really go hand in hand and they're part of a bigger story that's being told here by Melville. Chapter 12, Biographical, and chapter 13, Wheelbarrow, really zero in on Queequeg as a character, and then chapter 13 kind of touches up on Queequeg as a character and his relationship with Ishmael and how that relationship is viewed and perceived by the people around them in the story. Starting with chapter 12, Biographical, there's a night essentially where Ishmael and Queequeg can't fall asleep. At this point in the book, there was only one bed open in the inn they were staying in, so they essentially have to be roommates for a couple of nights while they're waiting to leave for Nantucket. There's a night where they can't fall asleep, and Ishmael and Queequeg are just talking about their life stories. While they're discussing their life stories, Queequeg starts to tell Ishmael about his background and where he's from. He lives in an island that's south and west of Florida. However, the entry paragraph of this chapter makes it a point to mention that this place is not down on any map. The text reads, "Queequeg was a native of Cocovoco, an island far away to the west and south. It is not down in any map. True places never are." This is also an interesting chapter because in this chapter I started to recognize the word choice when referring to Queequeg. In the earlier chapters, he's referred to as a cannibal. Later on, he's referred to as a heathen or a savage. The word choice that different characters use when discussing Queequeg and the culture he comes from is pretty important when it comes to understanding how these characters view him. Essentially, Queequeg comes from a long line of royalty on this island that he's from. He's born from the lineage of 30 pagan kings before him, and he even describes a lot of his aunts to have been married to great warriors on that island. When a Christian ship comes to their island, Queequeg really wants to go with the ship, one way or another he's not let on, so he ends up actually sneaking on to this Christian ship that sails away from his island. Initially, they're pretty angry at him for having snuck onto this ship. They want to execute him right there on the spot, but the captain of that ship admires his dedication and his determination, so the captain allows Queequeg to come along for the voyage. Ultimately, Ishmael ends up questioning Queequeg and asking him why he hasn't chose to return to his home island. His father was pretty terminally ill when Queequeg left, so if he were to return, he would easily be able to come back home and assume his spot on the throne. Queequeg's response to Ishmael's inquiries are absolutely baffling, and they're really hard to understand until they get explained in chapter 13. The text reads as follows. For at bottom, so he told me, he was actuated by a profound desire to learn among the Christians the arts whereby to make his people still happier than they were, and more than that, still better than they were. But alas, the practices of whalemen soon convinced him that even Christians could be both miserable and wicked, infinitely more so than all of his father's heathens. This conversation continues on page 62. By hints I asked him whether he did not propose going back, and having a coronation, since he might now consider his father dead and gone, he being very old and feeble at the last accounts. He answered no, not yet, and added that he was fearful Christianity, or rather Christians, had unfitted him for ascending the pure and undefiled throne of 30 pagan kings before him. But by and by he said he would return as soon as he felt himself baptized again. For the nonce, however, he proposed to sail about and sow his wild oats in all 4 oceans. Essentially, Queequeg tells Ishmael that he feels like he's been negatively impacted by Christianity, or rather by Christians that he sailed with, and he feels as if he's now unpure or unwilling of assuming his throne back home as the pagan king of his island. Doesn't make much sense until we tap into chapter 13. At this point, Ishmael and Queequeg need to take a smaller ship on a smaller trip in order to get to Nantucket, which is where they will then end up leaving on their more semi-permanent whaling voyage. So they're on this smaller ship heading to Nantucket when people start making some remarks and kind of start sneering at the fact that Ishmael and Queequeg, being a white Christian and a pagan, are both such tight friends, and there seems to be no cultural clash between them. Obviously, Queequeg and Ishmael's friendship is completely pure. They see past those boundaries of culture or religion, but the Christian men around them on the ship don't. As a result, some of the younger sailors who are on board this ship start to poke fun at Queequeg and Ishmael, which results in Queequeg jokingly roughing one up. From the way they described this little altercation, it seems almost as if Queequeg kind of picked this guy up, threw him up into the air, and held his harpoon beneath him as if he was going to stick the guy on the harpoon like a skewer or a kebab, ultimately just to move the harpoon and catch the guy and leave him standing straight up. It was obviously something that Queequeg did pretty playfully, but considering that he doesn't speak good English and these Christians on board already have a negative preconceived notion about Queequeg, the guy who he roughed up ultimately ends up turning around and running to the captain and trying to tell the captain that Queequeg tried to kill him. Obviously, Queequeg was just giving the guy a taste of his own medicine because the other guy was making some rude remarks about he and Ishmael. He didn't actually want to hurt him. If he wanted to hurt him, he very obviously could have. Queequeg is an absolute beast. This whole book describes him as like an absolutely insane warrior who's like jacked and has a bunch of tattoos. But point is that he was just playfully messing around with the guy, and the guy started going to the captain saying that Queequeg was trying to kill him. The captain, along with the other sailors on the ship, immediately began to start pressing Queequeg about how he needs to behave and how he better watch himself. At that very moment, things take a complete 180 turn for the worse. While this captain is absolutely drilling Queequeg, telling him that he could have him executed, the text states, "But it so happened just then that it was high time for the captain to mind his own eye. The prodigious strain upon the mainsail had parted the weather sheet, and the tremendous boom was now flying from side to side, completely sweeping the entire part of the deck. The poor fellow whom Queequeg had handled so roughly was swept overboard. All hands were in a panic, and to attempt snatching at the boom to stay it seemed madness. So to translate that from sailor terms, essentially Queequeg is getting chewed out, and while he's getting chewed out, the sails separate from the mast, and the wind starts blowing these sails all over the place, and the whole ship essentially goes into a panicked frenzy trying to figure out how to put the ship back together. And in the process of these sails getting knocked off of the mast and the sails getting blown all around in the wind, the guy who Queequeg was just getting teased by, who he then roughed up, gets swept overboard. I'll save you the details because it's a really fun chapter to read, and I do hope that you guys end up reading this book on your own. But essentially, Queequeg pulls a pretty quick maneuver. He ends up saving the ship, and then shortly after saving the ship, he jumps in the water and rescues the man who previously made fun of him. Most of the sailors didn't even realize that this man got swept overboard, but Queequeg, just being a selfless guy who doesn't know any better, jumps in, saves the dude, and brings him back on ship. All of these sailors start to glorify and start to look up to and start to praise Queequeg, which he's completely oblivious to. And not so much oblivious, I wouldn't say he's ignorant to it, but rather indifferent. He really doesn't care to be praised. He doesn't want to accept any of the gifts or rewards that they're trying to offer him. All he wants is some fresh water to wash the brine off of him, and he just wants to sit down and smoke his peace pipe. All of these sailors on the ship, who are described as Christians, essentially are using status and are using their socioeconomic structure in order to maintain roles of power and to denounce people who they dislike, like Queequeg, who might be of a different faith or of a different culture than them. But I think what Herman Melville's really getting at here is that Queequeg's people really value doing the right thing just for the sake of doing the right thing, whereas these sailors are all for doing the right thing in order to reestablish or uphold or maintain social structure or designated roles in the hierarchy within the ship. Ultimately, Queequeg doesn't want to challenge those rules. He's not trying to threaten anyone. He just doesn't care. He just really is indifferent to them. Ultimately, he wants to do the right thing because he feels like it's his moral obligation to do, hence the reason why he doesn't hesitate to save the ship, hence the reason why he doesn't hesitate to save the man who just wanted to get him executed, and he doesn't hesitate to just turn away from the rewards or the prizes people try to offer him. He just does the right thing because that's how he's raised, that's what his culture believes in. Whereas a lot of these men are using their culture or their faith or their socioeconomic status within this hierarchy on this ship in order to reinforce them being higher up or above someone else. It's a pretty interesting commentary that I really like because I think it shows that morals and just being a good person kind of transcends any kind of position on a ship. It transcends what car you drive. It transcends how much money you make. It transcends what religion you practice. Ultimately, if you choose to be a dick or if you choose to be a good guy is ultimately up to you, and that decision exists outside of any kind of social class. And I'll go ahead and end my commentary on this chapter with Queequeg's words himself. Queequeg says, quote, "It's a mutual joint stock world. In all meridians, we cannibals must help these Christians." Prior to reading Moby Dick, I watched quite a few different essays online, a few different video essays on YouTube discussing how you should approach reading Moby Dick, and one of them really made it a big point to mention how there's going to be multiple chapters that completely step back from the main storyline of whaling and the main storyline of the Pequod and its voyage. And these chapters really just answer more philosophical questions or look at whaling as a whole. The first really notable chapter of this type was chapter 24, The Advocate. Chapter 24 takes a step back from the journey, and Ishmael really just reflects on the practice of whaling as a whole. Ishmael speaks out on how people perceive whaling in a negative light, but he ends up trying to defend it by offering not only the utility that it has as far as the resources that are gained from killing whales, but he also talks about its roots in holiness in the Bible, its roots in divinity, in something greater than what is seen on the surface level. He claims that going whaling is a braver task than going to war. He claims that killing a whale is a more noble task than killing a man. It seems as if Ishmael almost throws a shot, calling these land dwellers who denounce whaling almost cowardly here on page 119 when he says, "Let me assure ye that many a veteran who has freely marched up to a battery would quickly recoil at the apparition of the sperm whale's vast tail, fanning into the eddies the air over his head. For what are the comprehensible terrors of man compared with the interlinked terrors and wonders of God? Facing the wrath of a whale is really like facing the wrath of God. As we touched up on in chapter 9, the sermon, whales are quite divine creatures that are directly referenced in biblical quotation. This biblical quotation, talking about how holy whales are and how they truly are divine, is touched up on in page 121. Quote, "Who wrote the first account of our Leviathan? Who but mighty Job? And who composed the first narrative of a whaling voyage? Who but no less a prince than Alfred the Great? Who with his own royal pen took down the words from Other, the Norwegian whale hunter of those times? And who pronounced our glowing eulogy in Parliament? Who but Edmund Burke?" This rant from Ishmael continues on page 122 when he continues to state, "No dignity in whaling? The dignity of our calling the very heavens attest. Cetus is a constellation in the south, no more. Drive down your hat in presence of the Caesar, and take it off to Queequeg. No more. I know a man that, in his lifetime, has taken 350 whales. I account it that man more honorable than that great captain of antiquity who boasted of taking as many walled towns." You heard it from Ishmael himself. It's more prestigious to take down whales than it is to take down walled towns. The dignity in whaling is facing the wrath of the forces greater than you, facing them head on, and being willing to stand up and to fight without cowardly backing down. Fighting on land is the work of mere mortals. Fighting in the ocean and fighting directly face to face with whales is quite literally the work of God. And even at this point, only 25 chapters into the book, I'm sold, as environmentally and as inhumane as whaling is, I'm sold on this romanticized idea that Ishmael has of the philosophical and the mental and emotional and spiritual journey that whaling really is. I think anyone who's gotten to this point in the book wants to go out to sea and wants to hop on a boat at one point or another in their life. The sperm whale really is, in my opinion, one of the terrors of God. And I think that Herman Melville does a great job of really explaining how this sperm whale, or how whales in general rather, are really just larger than life, and they really are designed by God, and they are a just huge part of the philosophical questions that are offered in this book. So at the time I'm recording this, I'm starting to write the video for chapter 2. That one will be up shortly after this one. Like I said, check out the link in the description down below. That being said, if you're new, please leave a comment down below, start a discussion about the book, or just about self-improvement in one field or another. Of course, if you enjoyed, leave a like, and subscribe if you're new. Until next time, I'm the host. You're watching The Gray Medium. Stay gray.